Now, before I get into the video, I want to say that everything you hear in this story is 100% real. There have been a few comments, people saying that, some things are AI generated, which are completely false, because right now there is a huge issue on YouTube with AI generated content, especially in history. There are documentaries being made with completely false information, it's actually terrible, which is actually, it's bad. But everything we hear is 100% real. Obviously, it isn't one for one of what I copy. I've obviously as well paraphrased some bits. I've definitely made things a bit more dramatized for your enjoyment, but all the people, all the engagements, everything you hear is 100% real. Because, we do live in a weird time now with YouTube where a lot of stuff you can't trust anymore, which is sad. So I can see why people think that my stuff could be AI, but no. It's 100% real, it's made by me, I narrate it all. So before we do start as well, if you wouldn't mind liking the video and subscribing, because liking the video helps it boost up and we can get these stories further out there. Because these stories need to be told, these are stories that haven't been told really by anyone. They are severely brutal and they do need to be spread more because, there's so much more to history than we are told. So yeah, by liking the video, you're pushing the video out there more and also leaving me a comment. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.
Today, I bring you one of the most harrowing and overlooked accounts of the Eastern Front, the true story of Hendrick C. Verton, a Dutch volunteer in the Waffen-SS who faced the full horror of the Russian winter outside Moscow. This is not a tale of strategy or politics, but of pure survival, of men freezing alive in their foxholes, of endless snow, and of the terrifying silence between Soviet artillery barrages. Verton's words pull us deep into the heart of the most brutal winter campaign of the war, a world where death came not only from bullets, but from the cold itself. Prepare yourself for the most chilling story we've told yet, one of frostbitten limbs, shattered hopes, and the iron discipline it took to stay alive when all seemed lost. I still remember that first winter. Not just the cold, it wasn't simply cold, it was something else entirely, something unnatural. That year in the north, the temperature plummeted to minus 52 degrees Celsius. Locals said it hadn't been that bitter in over a century. And they were right. No soldier alive, and no weapon ever forged could fight that kind of enemy. Cold like that isn't something you endure. It becomes part of you, it seeps into your bones, hollows out your strength, and replaces it with a dull, aching numbness. Men froze where they stood, rifles still slung over their shoulders, eyes wide open in disbelief, as if death itself had caught them mid-thought. The Soviets called it a miracle. They said General Winter had come to save them, had given them what they later called the wonder of Moscow, and maybe it had. For the first time in months, Stalin no longer sat hunched in fear within the Kremlin. He finally had hope. Up until then, not even the harsh terrain or any Soviet defense could stop our momentum. The Wehrmacht had marched like an iron fist across the east, but now something had shifted. Back in October, General Moroz Frost had begun his work slowing us down. By November, the snow finished the job. Vehicles refused to start, guns jammed, fingers blackened. To walk, to breathe, to simply exist, everything became a struggle. That summer we'd crossed the Berezina River, one of the Dnieper's tributaries. The Soviets had feared that crossing like a curse out of their own history. Napoleon had tried the same thing in 1812, and his Grande Armée had collapsed there during their retreat. They called that river a death omen, and some among us began to believe it too. But still we advanced. We reached the edge of Moscow, just 18 kilometers from the tram lines at the city's fringe. You could feel it then, the panic in the air. Privileged officials packed their cases and fled beyond the Volga. Whole ministries evacuated. Shops were looted, homes abandoned. People ran wild with fear. Some party members even burned their membership books. There were no more speeches, just gunshots. The NKVD executed mutineers in the streets and opened prison gates. It was chaos, bloody, chaotic fear. Zhukov, the Red Commander, threw everything he had into Moscow's defense. He scraped together 100,000 civilians into makeshift militia divisions and turned more than 500,000 citizens into human fortifications, digging tank traps, barricading streets, sleeping with rifles beside their children. The laws of the front now applied to the civilians. Cowards, panic makers, traitors, all shot. There would be no retreat, not for them, not for us. And yet, Moscow never fell. Just when it seemed within reach, the game changed. A German communist, Dr. Richard Sorge, working as a correspondent in Tokyo, delivered intelligence to Stalin that turned the tide. He told them Japan would not enter the war in the West. No reinforcements would come from the Japanese Kwantung Army. That freed up 150 Soviet divisions, plus 44 more brigades from the Far East. They were well rested, fully equipped, and trained to fight in blizzards and forests, Mongolian cavalry, Siberian veterans, hardened men of the East, and soon they would be facing us. Before we could even make sense of what was happening, it began. It was just after dawn when we were hit. Our new quarters inside a railway station blown open by a Soviet fighter that dropped a high explosive bomb from above. It struck barely 15 feet from us. I didn't even hear it coming. Just an impact, deafening, final. The tar-covered roof peeled off like paper, the walls crumbled inward, and we were thrown to the floor. Some of the men were wounded, bleeding from their heads or ears. But it wasn't the pain that got to us. It was the silence that followed. The sense that Moscow was no longer a city we were going to take. It had become a trap we had walked into. The next morning, trucks came. The frost had no mercy, and the wheels squealed over the packed snow as we moved deeper toward the front. Our unit had been reassigned. We were to attach ourselves to a battalion of the SS Motorized Infantry Brigade, and so the convoy moved, one long frozen column, snaking its way through the endless white void of the Russian steppe. There were no landmarks, no real road, only wooden posts hammered into the earth with bundles of straw tied to them to guide us forward. On either side stretched an ocean of snow. Bleak, silent, absolute. We were driving into something we didn't yet understand. Into a battlefield no map could fully explain. Into winter, into madness, into the jaws of a war that was just beginning to show its true face. Even with wool gloves on our hands, it didn't matter. The cold cut through them like they weren't even there. You could feel your fingers begin to die if you held still for too long. We beat our hands against our chests, shook our fingers, stomped our boots, anything to keep the blood moving. Our boots, perfect, back in Austria or Carinthia, were now like frozen boxes around our feet. The pain was constant. When you couldn't feel your toes anymore, that's when you knew you were in trouble. There were no breaks, no stopping to relieve yourself. If nature called, you opened the cargo hatch of the truck, held on for dear life, and hoped your comrade gave you a steady hand. It was humiliating. But out there, decency had no place. It was survival. When the lorry finally stopped, bogged down by snowdrifts, we didn't complain. We jumped out and started shoveling. Hard labor was the only way to get warm. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of artillery echoed across the plain. We were close now. The front wasn't far. At around 3 in the afternoon, the light began to fade. Russian December, the grey sky turned slate, and then black, pierced now and then by the streak of tracer fire on the horizon. Eventually, we had to dismount and continue on foot. The snow was so deep, every step was a curse. Marching didn't exist anymore. It was a slog. Occasionally, a column of tanks would pass, and we'd clamber aboard. I remember riding a Panzer IV, exposed to the wind and cold, teeth chattering. But it was better than walking, that is, until a Soviet fighter appeared, swooping low from the clouds. At first we waved. We thought it was one of ours, but then we saw the red star, and then the bullets came. The Panzer zigzagged wildly, trying to dodge. The fighter riddled the tank with fire, and one hit to the track brought it to a shuddering halt. We jumped off, diving into snow. Miraculously, none of us were hit. The tank crew began trying to repair the damage, but the steel was frozen stiff, clinging to their fingers like ice on skin. My friend Robbie and I stood helpless. There was nothing we could do, and worse, we were now separated from the rest of the battalion. So, we made a decision, a bad one. We left the tank behind and started walking, kilometre after kilometre, nothing but snow and wind and silence, no houses, no people, just exhaustion. Just when we thought we might collapse, we spotted a building, a farm cottage, tucked beneath bare trees. Smoke curled from the chimney. Life. But was it German or Soviet? Weapons ready, hearts pounding, we stepped into the unknown village. The snow muffled everything. It was deathly quiet. Burned-out homes stood like skeletons, stone chimneys, blackened beams, no footprints, no voices, just us and the wind. We moved like ghosts until we reached the small cottage with the smoke. The door wasn't locked. A tattered horse blanket hung in place of a curtain. We pushed inside. "Hands up! Ruki Verk!" But it wasn't soldiers, it was a Russian farming family, a mother, a father, a child, huddled by a stove, wide-eyed and afraid. They'd seen soldiers only hours earlier. Cossacks, they told us, with trembling hands. This place, this no-man's land, had changed hands too many times to count. Civilians either fled or died. Those left behind were hollow-eyed, resigned. Our hosts were the last in the village. Everyone else had been killed or conscripted. Once they realized we weren't there to harm them, they relaxed. The woman cooked potatoes in their skins. She gave us onions, frozen, raw. It tasted like heaven. We gave them chocolate bars in return. Our rations were gone now, but they had been kind to us. We shared the warmth of their home, the light of their lamp, and unfortunately, their fleas. That night, Robbie and I took turns keeping watch. Outside, the sky was filled with stars, and the red glow of battle shimmered just over the trees. The snow reflected it like a mirror. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. We left before dawn. We had no idea where we were. Every village looked the same. Maybe it was Krasnaya, maybe not. All we knew was that we were still lost. We wandered through deep snow the whole day, found another village, empty, silent. We dared not rest in the open, so we sheltered in a burned-out barn, lying on damp straw surrounded by shadows. The front line guided us only by sound now. No maps, no signs. Hunger gnawed at us. Our only food was a handful of sunflower seeds washed down with melted snow. Our feet ached, our lips cracked. I could feel frost clinging to the hair on my face. And then finally, salvation. An abandoned military bus on a slant by the roadside. The windows were frosted over. We scraped them clear and peered inside. Germans, dozens, blankets wrapped around them, heads bowed, some upright, some curled like children. They were all dead, frozen in place. Rigor mortis had turned them into statues. There was no driver, no one left alive, just yellowed skin and silence. We left that iron tomb without a word. The snow swallowed our footprints. Eventually, a convoy of horse-drawn sledges took us in, troikas transporting shells to the front. It was almost peaceful, like something out of a Russian fairy tale. But the sleigh bells were silent, and the village wells were frozen solid. At one stop, we saw a signpost. 6 kilometers, it said. 6 kilometers to our battalion. We were so close, but as we approached, a voice screamed, "Get your heads down! Are you tired of life?" We had wandered right into an exposed position. 2 sentries pulled us behind a wall of snow. They pointed us to the command post. The sergeant major stared like he'd seen ghosts. We had already been marked as missing. Our names were to be sent up the chain. Our return was met with joy, but it didn't last long. In our absence, things had gone to hell. A supply convoy had vanished in the snow. The Russians captured it. When our troops retook the ground, they found the prisoners, Norwegians from our own battalion, beaten to death and frozen in the Oka River. Our commander was dead. Casualties were heavy. Morale was worse. Robbie and I were needed. Badly. The platoon leader just shook his head and said, "Not even in battle, and you get yourselves lost. Then you must be well rested." That night, we were ordered on reconnaissance, midnight patrol, 12 men, into the woods. The front had waited long enough. Now it was our turn to face the fire. We followed our corporal in a single file, moving in silence through the frozen landscape. He carried a machine pistol, while the rest of us held our rifles low, keeping a distance of a few meters between each man. The cold was unreal, bone deep, the kind that stung the inside of your nose and made your eyes water beneath the white hood of your winter camouflage. A pale yellow moon lit the dark forest around us, casting long black shadows that made every tree look like an enemy. No one said a word. The only sound was the hard crunch of frost beneath our boots and the occasional crack of a twig, sounds that made us wince every time they echoed too loud. We were barely inside the tree line when we started stumbling into shell craters hidden beneath the snow. The whole area had been pounded by artillery from both sides. The woods had seen death before. And we knew we weren't alone. Every flicker of movement, every shadow between the trees twisted our imaginations. You felt eyes on you from every angle. Somewhere out there, the enemy was watching, waiting. Every time the moon disappeared behind the clouds, a Soviet flare would shoot up into the sky, turning the forest into an eerie daylight. We froze each time, expecting the burst of machine gun fire to follow, but nothing came. Then darkness would fall again, as if the forest exhaled a breath it had been holding. We began to believe the woods were empty, and then, out of nowhere, a Soviet machine gun opened up. Red tracer rounds laced the air, and we hit the ground instantly. The soil was frozen solid. You couldn't dig in, only try to melt into the ice and pray you weren't next. Then I felt it, a hard thump in my gut, not pain, just a cold shock washing over my entire body. For a second I thought I was done for. The next burst hit our platoon leader in the spine. He screamed, a high, raw sound that broke the paralysis. That was the spark. We pulled ourselves together. Training took over. Hidden behind tree trunks or lying flat, we opened fire. The firefight exploded in all directions. They were all around us. It was probably a Russian patrol sent to clear the same woods. We'd run headfirst into each other. The corporal's second in command gave me the order, get help for the wounded. I turned and ran, breath steaming in front of my face. In the chaos, I tripped over what I thought was a tree. But as I looked back to push myself up, I saw his face, a dead Russian, eyes frozen open, pale as wax, staring up into the sky like a frost-covered ghost. I bolted. I made it back to the trench line, nearly forgetting the password in my panic. Breathless, I reported to the command post, and 2 medics followed me back. We tied the corporal onto a Finnish sled, just a curved wooden plank with no runners, and dragged him through the snow to the battery aid station. He died that night. That was my baptism of fire. From that point forward, the shooting never stopped. Every day, every hour, we were tested. You learned to cope, to become colder than the wind itself. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. You still felt the ache of each new death. I remember wondering, silently, like many others, will I be able to pass the test? But the truth was, there was no passing or failing. The war was the test, every day. We couldn't afford to mess around, as General Guderian had once barked. That phrase didn't apply to us anymore, not here, not in this place, where survival itself was an act of defiance. The battle for Moscow had frozen to death, for us and for the Soviets between Ural and the Don. The generals in the Kremlin were now convinced that Hitler's army would collapse like Napoleon's, and though we didn't see the full scope of the front, we knew that whatever was coming next would be worse. We'd been thrown into the meat grinder without even proper winter clothing. We had no reference point, no experience to draw from. Russia was an endless sea of snow and fog and alien faces. The only things we knew of this place were Napoleon's retreat and the bloodshed of the First World War. The past had warned us, but no one listened. And now the elite regiments from Siberia and Mongolia, fresh, well-equipped, were crawling across the snow toward us at night. Covered in fur-lined jackets and insulated boots, they attacked in waves, overwhelming our thin lines. Our war shrank to village by village, building by building. There was no cover, no retreat. Digging in meant death. The frost turned our boots to bricks and froze our limbs stiff. When the wounded couldn't be moved, they simply froze to death. We scavenged for anything. Russian felt boots, called valenki, thick as carpet, while the Finnish troops laughed at our leather boots that cracked like glass. Behind the lines, we made shoes out of straw. No fur-lined helmets, just thin wool under our steel pots. Germany sent out calls for supplies. The people answered, piling blankets and gear into donation centers. But barely any of it reached us. What arrived was a drop in a frozen ocean. Our regiment was down to a third of its strength. Frostbite took more than bullets. By the end of December 1941, 750,000 men had been lost on the Eastern Front, nearly 1 in 4. Typhoid, dysentery, influenza, and the bitter cold wiped out tens of thousands more. Frostbite alone hit over 100,000. The Soviets lost heavily too, but they had reserves, endless reserves, and their soldiers were built differently. Quiet, simple, unbelievably tough. A bag of millet on the belt, some dried fish, vodka in a thermos. That was their rations. They rolled cigarettes with newspaper and smoked harsh tobacco that tasted like burning leaves and tree bark. They felt no pity, no warmth. They kept coming, always, like machines. Their commanders didn't flinch at massive casualties. They threw their men forward until the machine guns jammed from heat and blood. Some Soviets, rather than be captured, blew themselves up with grenades. Others charged like old-world grenadiers, wave after suicidal wave. It was a war unlike anything we had seen. And Hitler called it the greatest crusade in history. For us on the ground, it was survival. Nothing more. We fought because the alternative was unthinkable. Capture meant torture, mutilation, death. The Soviets had refused the Geneva Convention. If they took you alive, you didn't stay alive for long. Sometimes the sun would shine briefly in December, painting the horizon blood red. And that's when it hit you, the longing for home. Every sentry, every patrol quietly whispered goodbye to someone back in Germany. What began as adventure had rotted into homesickness and despair. That land was not a place for men. It was the end of the world. The mist clung to the ground until mid-morning, with daylight peeking through around 11 and fading again by 4. By late afternoon, our mission wasn't to fight. It was to find warmth to survive the night. We'd squeeze into a farmhouse, often little more than a wooden shack with a clay floor and a wood-burning stove. And though we used to laugh at the primitiveness of these peasant homes, we now treated them like bunkers. We defended them with our lives. Inside, a whole Russian family would be sleeping on top of the stove, wrapped in rags. The heat was life. Straw on the floor was enough. The smell of soup on the fire was a reminder that our blood still ran warm. Sometimes a baby hung from the ceiling in a cradle made of rope, swinging gently overhead as we tried to sleep. In one of those houses, I remember her, Anushka. She was the oldest daughter, maybe 20. Asian features, bitter and hard from suffering. She was a teacher, spoke a little German. She didn't hide her belief in communism, and though she was curious about us, she kept her distance. I never knew if she was truly part of that family or a planted partisan. We were too green to tell the difference. But we noticed one thing. Beneath that patched-up Soviet jacket of hers, something was always hidden. Anushka had a lovely figure, and despite her cold demeanour, we all noticed it, especially when her white headscarf slipped and revealed her dark, silky hair. She stole quick glances at us, and maybe we imagined the faintest smile, but in that winter wasteland, even a smile felt like a warm fire. Whenever our rations arrived, if they arrived, the family we lodged with always benefited. But the supply lines froze just like everything else. The roads were glass, and lorries needed to be dragged behind half-tracks. Our warm food came from the battalion's field kitchen, some lukewarm stew in a double-barreled container slung on a sledge pulled by starving ponies. It was a long haul through open fire zones, and many Russians probably ate better than we did when our supply runners were gunned down en route. Still, our rations were better than in training. 650 grams of bread, a scrap of butter, cheese, a bit of meat, synthetic jam, weak chicory coffee, and 6 Juno cigarettes we almost never got to enjoy. There are words that need no embellishment in war. Expulsion, evacuation, refugee. Each one carries the taste of apocalypse. Even the poorest shack is still a man's home, and to lose that, to be thrown into the void, is a sorrow few ever recover from. We, wandering soldiers, cut off from the world, far from radios or phones, lived in crumbling shelters that had become more than shelter. They were lifelines. In a nearby village now deserted, we garrisoned a few houses to form a front line. It was a hellish, hour-long march to reach it, through northern winds and drifts waist-deep. Yellow patches of skin meant frostbite was coming, so we rubbed each other's faces with snow, a crude but necessary medicine to stay alive. We tried to make our shelter feel like home. In one hut, someone had scrawled on the ceiling with soot, "Humor is laughing in the face of disaster." I'd lie on my straw bed and stare at those words, trying to draw courage from them. We had our share of jesters too. Two Danish twins from Copenhagen, both 18, with white blonde hair and baby pink cheeks. They looked like they'd stepped out of a propaganda magazine. They were athletic, good soldiers, though their thick Danish accent butchered every bit of German they tried to speak. We nicknamed them Sursu, after the way they shouted Turzu. Close the door, every time someone let a draft in. One morning, we found their trench empty. They were gone. We never saw them again. Likely the Soviets had used the snowstorm to sneak in, slit throats, or drag them away in silence. It happened often. We shot flares into the sky every night to let the Russians know we were alert, while wolves prowled too close for comfort, their eyes glowing like coals. On moonlit nights, we could see the enemy's outline across the no-man's land, and knew that same moon was shining down on our families far away. One December afternoon, a biplane suddenly buzzed, low, over the village. We ran outside, half-dressed, to see the pilot grinning down at us through his leather helmet and goggles. We fired wildly with pistols and rifles, hopeless, pointless. He bowed his wings and vanished eastward, only to return that night and drop 2 bombs from his cockpit by hand. No casualties, just terror. We came to call them sewing machines. Slow, loud, and always just annoying enough to keep you awake. Our battalion held several villages. With only 800 men, we had to guard 3 or 4 times the usual frontage. Communication was only possible under cover of night. We used the same path every time, weaving between thin birchwoods until it became routine, and then a trap. The Russians planted mines, some with near-invisible tripwires. 2 comrades were blown to pieces. Engineers with detectors followed us, but the enemy had outsmarted us. Their mines were cased in wood, undetectable. So we tried deception. Ski troops laid false trails, looping back to ambush spots. It worked. The Russians followed the tracks, walking straight into our guns. But they were always learning, adapting, twisting nature and terrain in their favor. They even tunneled beneath us, building snow-covered rat runs right into our trenches. Siberians, the masters of snow and silence. Then came something beyond imagination. Dogs. They strapped explosives to Alsatians and Dobermans, trained them to run under tanks, living mines. The Eastern Front spared nothing, not even animals. I saw horrors I'll never forget, like in Musino, where an entire Russian cavalry regiment charged our machine guns. 1,000 men on horseback, sabers shining in the sun, galloping into death. The snow turned red. They were slaughtered before reaching us. It was like the Polish Uhlans in 1939 all over again. None of us were touched. And then, on the 4th Sunday of Advent, our men from the 3rd Panzer Regiment stumbled across something frozen in time. A Russian cavalry unit, caught in a snowstorm, had huddled together with their horses. They froze standing. A man still in his saddle, eyes wide open, dead with his hand frozen to the reins. Men and horses alike turned to statues of ice. Even the helpless suffered. I once found a snow-covered Cossack horse standing beside his dead master. Snow up to his belly, unable to move, quietly neighing for help. We did what we could, but decades later, I still wonder why we weren't more moved. Had we grown numb? Had we hardened too much, become too busy with ourselves? Perhaps we simply couldn't carry more pain. When we buried our first comrade, it was like a slap from reality. No hero's death, just wide, glassy eyes and a yellowed face. The same man who joked and shared stories about his sister, now stiff and gone. A medic collected his dog tag, a paybook stained with blood. Somewhere, a clerk typed the same empty words to his mother. He died bravely. a good soldier. She'd weep for a son already forgotten by the front, and when the order came to dig the grave, we used hand grenades. The ground was too hard. We drove a metal rod into the earth, poured water around the grenade to freeze it in place, pulled the pin, and ran. The explosion blasted apart the frozen soil. We repeated the process until a hole was big enough for a body. That was war. Even burial became violence. By then, we had shed our illusions. No more fairy tales of valor. There were no shining moments, no gallantry, just cold fear and exhaustion. Every one of us felt sick before battle. My greatest fear wasn't dying, it was being taken alive. Or worse, a bullet to the head. Come to think of it, wasn't I the same? We all were. Every one of us, consciously or not, did what we could to avoid death when the chance presented itself. That instinct, that deeply human urge for self-preservation, it never leaves you, not even in war. But in wartime, avoiding danger is too often labelled cowardice. Guilt gets smeared across every man whether he deserves it or not. But I'll say this plainly. The fools who charge blindly into heroics usually died quick, meaningless deaths. Just knowing how to use a rifle never meant you had courage, not in my eyes. What mattered was discipline, level-headedness, and unity. Within a company or a battalion, that kind of cohesion created high standards. It meant fewer wasted bullets, fewer reckless choices. I valued the soldier who thought clearly under fire far more than the one who pretended to be fearless. A comrade who knew what he was doing, who didn't take foolish risks. He was worth his weight in gold to me. We were called an elite, and so we were expected to act like one, always. The pressure to meet that constant standard was immense. It required razor-sharp reflexes honed by endless drilling, and obedience that left no room for hesitation. Instinct was discouraged, even punished. There wasn't always the threat of a court-martial, it was more than that. It was psychological. We lived by the code. If I don't do it, we're all dead. That was the spark that drove us forward. Not fear, not orders, but duty, twisted and absolute. The Soviets under Stalin took it even further. Deserters or those lacking resolve were shot on the spot. No trial. If you surrendered, your death sentence was waiting back home. Worse, they'd arrest your family for your so-called betrayal. Stalin's order, number 270, made that brutally clear. It was a world without forgiveness, where faltering meant not only your death, but the suffering of those you loved. General Douglas MacArthur once said, "The world is a constant conspirator against the courageous." He was right. In defeated Germany, the virtue of the frontline soldier was mocked. Our medals, our honours, dismissed as glitter, as tinsel, worthless. While we fought and bled, future slanderers sharpened their knives. They had no idea what that war took from us. "My honour is my loyalty," they'd mock. But to us, it wasn't just a slogan, it was everything. That loyalty would be tested, yet again, just before Christmas 1941. We knew, without needing to say it aloud, that this march eastward might be our last. A strategic town had slipped from Wehrmacht hands, and now it was our job, the Waffen-SS, to claw it back. Around noon, a thick force of us, all in white camouflage, gathered and advanced across the bleak, windswept steppe. As dusk crept in, we saw distant woods etched against the horizon like black slashes. And then we came across the retreating Wehrmacht. It looked like a ghost army. The dead were wrapped in rags and stacked on carts like frozen firewood. Their boots had already been stripped and given to the living. Some had yellow feet poking out, wrapped in hole-ridden socks or bloody scraps of tent cloth. At least they didn't feel the cold anymore. Others, barely clinging to life, were laid on sledges, dragged by emaciated ponies. Their moans rose from beneath tattered sacks and bloody straw. It was a vision of hell, and for us, a warning. Men shuffled past us, their eyes blank, their faces hollowed by frost and horror. They didn't speak, they just stared. Fresh meat, they were probably thinking. Cannon fodder, just like them. No words of hope were exchanged. Only gallows humour kept us upright. "The guard may die, but never surrender," someone muttered. We held on to each other like men boarding a sinking ship. American historian Charles Sidner wrote that when everything seemed lost, it was the Waffen-SS who were thrown into the fire. And it was true. When no one else could hold the line, they sent us in. Our patrol leader, Iron Cross on his chest, shouted over the wind, "Don't pretend you're not scared, we all are. Now let's move." Snowbanks slowed our every step. Our noses and ears froze in minutes. Finally, tanks arrived to support us. Panzer IVs painted white, though their red glowing exhausts gave them away. We climbed aboard, holding on to whatever we could, following the glow ahead of us like moths to a flame. That glow made perfect targets. The tanks churned snow into thick clouds as we rumbled toward the village. Suddenly, we jumped down. The terrain was flat and exposed, and though the resistance was weak at first, a few shots, some flares, the quiet didn't last. From the woods ahead came a ripping volley of machine gun fire. Our own guns replied in kind, cutting down anything that moved between the trees. Tracers lit the night like sparks from a forge, crisscrossing the dark. Then came the dreaded sound, or rather, the lack of it. The Soviets had a weapon we called the Ratchbum, a 7.62 centimeter shell that gave no warning. You didn't hear it coming, just the explosion and the gut-punching shockwave that followed. Shells screamed down without mercy, the ground convulsed. Smoke and powder choked the air. We pressed ourselves against the tanks for cover, but our commanders screamed at us to move. We clung to the metal like terrified children. The tanks became magnets for fire. Each blast shook them like toys. We sweated under our white camouflage despite the cold, stripping off layers as the inferno roared. Grenade grips dug into our legs as we hit the dirt, crawled, ran, and dropped again. Wounded men screamed for help. The dead didn't move, just lay twisted in snow, their white coats stained red. Still, we pushed on. The Panzer IVs fired into the woods, their barrels swiveling, their shells cracking trees in two. The Russians then brought out something new, the Stalin organ, their dreaded Katyusha rockets. Missiles arced into the air with comet tails, exploding in blinding flashes and deafening booms. The psychological toll was brutal, but their accuracy overrated. Most of the rockets missed. The damage was minor. Still, the sound alone could break weaker men. We finally reached the village and surrounded it. Then began the worst part, house-to-house fighting. We kicked through splintered doorways and jumped over burning beams, bayonets ready. The houses weren't empty. We shouted into the rubble. "Tovarish, idi svuda," begging Red soldiers to surrender. When they didn't, we tossed grenades through broken windows, smoke, screams, and dust, but little real damage unless you were unlucky. We cleared room after room. Our frostbitten fingers clung to weapons, our ears ringing from nearby mortar blasts. The wounded were dragged to the church that had become our aid station. The dead, they sank into the snow, into the madness, into the same cold grave we all feared. And then it hit me. I felt nothing at first, just noticed my green glove turning red. A splinter or bullet had sliced through my thumb. Not serious enough to send me home, of course. Just enough pain to stay with me for years. Nerve damage, maybe. It never fully healed. I made my way to the church. From outside it looked untouched, but inside the communists had long since stripped it of its soul. No belfry, faded paint, broken windows, once sacred, now used as a warehouse. Another casualty of Stalin's world, blunt, soulless, hollow. And so I sat, bloodied but alive, in that ruined church, among comrades groaning on stretchers and priests' icons broken underfoot. We had taken the village, but we had left another piece of ourselves behind. In our bunker, we shared everything like brothers, our misery, our blood, our lice, and even the tiniest luxuries sent from home. A slice of homemade bread, a small bar of chocolate, a sausage wrapped in wax paper. It wasn't just food, it was a reminder that someone out there still believed we existed, that we mattered beyond the snow and smoke. These moments were fleeting, but they lifted us from the pit. They made us feel human again, if only for an hour. But the moment always passed and reality returned quickly. The Eastern Front had no patience for sentiment. Every day bled into the next, a carousel of bitter cold, hunger, waiting, and sudden, eruptive death. When the wind howled across the steppe, it seemed to carry the voices of the dead, men we once knew, now buried under white sheets of snow or blown apart in the frozen soil, and still we stayed, not because we were fearless, but because fear had become irrelevant. There was nowhere to run. One morning in late January, our patrol leader returned with grave news. Soviet reconnaissance units had been spotted along the western ridge, probing our lines. Their build-up was not just preparation for a strike, it was already underway. We were ordered to brace for a new offensive, despite our depleted ranks and failing morale. Reinforcements were a fantasy. Supplies barely arrived. We counted bullets like coin, and yet no one deserted. We tied our boots tighter, adjusted the rags around our fingers, and prepared to kill once more, not because we wanted to, but because we had to, for each other. When the Soviet artillery began again, it came without warning. A curtain of fire tore into our positions, churning the snow into mud and blood. One of our sentries was vaporized where he stood. Another lost both legs in a single flash. The smell of burning flesh and powder was so thick I gagged behind my scarf. The enemy infantry surged in waves, screaming like animals. They were close enough for me to see the frost glittering on their eyebrows as they came over the ridge. My fingers found the trigger by instinct. I don't even remember pulling it. I only remember the recoil and the bodies dropping, one by one, until my magazine clicked empty and I reached for another. We held that line for 3 days. No sleep, no warmth, just blood and bullets. We lost half the company in that time, some torn apart by mortars, some simply vanished into the blizzard. I saw a man crawl toward us without arms, sobbing for his mother. I saw another shoot himself in the throat to escape the agony of being burned. I still see their faces at night. When the Soviets finally broke off the assault, the snowfield in front of us looked like a slaughterhouse. Blackened corpses lay twisted in unnatural shapes. The ice had frozen their blood into red veins across the white. We walked through them in silence, scavenging anything useful, ammunition, boots, even the padded jackets off their corpses. There was no shame left, only survival. And then, as if the front itself had sighed, things went quiet again. For a while. That's how it always was. Violence and stillness, back and forth like a pendulum swinging between madness and numbness. We were never truly safe, only lucky. At night, in the bunker, we'd sit in silence with our thoughts. Some men wept quietly, others stared at the fire until their eyes dried out. I remember writing a letter to my mother during one of those nights. I didn't tell her about the blood, or the lice, or the man who froze to death sitting upright with his eyes open. I just told her I was alive, that I was eating well, that I missed home. All lies, but lies were sometimes all we had left. By February, we knew the offensive would never stop. More Soviets came every day, new tanks, new artillery. The lines were bending, cracking, bleeding, but still we stood. Because that was all we could do. The war had carved us into creatures that could no longer run, only endure. And in enduring we became something else entirely. Something harder, something colder, something beyond fear. We weren't the same boys who had marched east with songs on our lips. Those men were long gone, swallowed by the snows, by the fire, by the silence of a god who no longer answered. We were shadows now, soldiers of ice, and we had miles still to go. Even in the lulls between battles, reminders of home arrived, marked with thick black stamps warning us, caution, flammable, especially in heath and forest areas. It became a running joke. We were surrounded by fire already, mortar barrages, artillery screams, burning trees. And yet here we were, being warned about flammable parcels from home. In the worst moments, when shells exploded around us, someone would shout it mockingly, "Caution! Flammable!" And the trench would erupt with bitter laughter. It helped keep madness at bay, but not all of us got mail. Mine came rarely. I remember staring at others reading their letters, trying not to feel forgotten. Only long after the war did we learn that Dutch postal workers had been destroying field mail destined for the Eastern Front in silent protest. Perhaps they imagined themselves heroes. Perhaps they thought their sabotage would help Stalin win. All it did was steal hope from young men like me. The cold didn't just bite, it crushed the body into uselessness. By New Year, we were barely combat effective. Sentry shifts were reduced from 2 hours to just 30 minutes, and even then, many still collapsed. One boy was found slumped against the trench wall, dead in his sleep. There was no alcohol permitted, none, not even a sip of schnapps for courage. The Russians, of course, drank like devils. They swore by their vodka, pouring full glasses like water, a whole tumbler downed in one gulp, no grimace, no pause. When vodka ran out, they sucked alcohol from airplane exhausts, filtered it through gas mask filters, and mixed it with syrup to make something resembling a liqueur, then drank it like salvation. The Soviets waged psychological war too. Their propaganda blared from rusty loudspeakers strung across the trees, sometimes playing songs, sometimes delivering soft lies. "Surrender to the Red Army," one message promised, "and you'll return home after the war. There are girls waiting, food, warmth." We knew better. Still, the Spanish boys from the Blue Division sometimes paused to listen. They'd come from the sunlit lands of Iberia, unprepared for this frozen hell. Their eyes lingered a little too long on promises of warmth. We used the leaflets as toilet paper or to roll cigarettes, which felt like the proper response. Sometimes we fired a burst of machine gun fire into the trees just to shut up the speakers. But we were no strangers to propaganda ourselves. The Waffen-SS had its own propaganda units, men who fought first, then filmed, wrote, and broadcast second. The PK, propaganda company, would eventually become the Kurt Eggers unit, named after a fallen war correspondent. Their Russian language broadcasts were fluent, persuasive, and they worked. We saw dozens of Russians desert when the odds turned against them. Their desperation was real. Our voices offered them an escape, bloodless and quick. Fear at some point becomes a part of your skin. You carry it, but it no longer paralyzes. That transformation is what makes a soldier. Courage isn't some roaring beast, it's a silence after your fear has gone dry. We lived by a brutal logic. If you hesitated, you died. If you fired first, you lived. Simple. Inhuman, but simple. But even that cold clarity crumbled under the weight of surprise. Nothing shattered your nerve like a sudden Russian charge. They leapt from the snow, shrieking, "Ura!" in unison, surrounding you in seconds. Worse still were the tanks. When the T-34s came rumbling from the birchwoods, their engines roaring with 500 horsepower and an aura of invincibility, we could only dive into the earth and pray. I saw even our most unshakable men falter. The T-34 was Stalin's true hammer. General Guderian himself had admitted it with grim admiration. With its low silhouette and massive treads, it crossed frozen marshland and soft fields without effort. The Panzer IV couldn't keep up. Later, the Panther and the Tiger would try to match it. But in that winter of 1942, nothing on wheels could rival the T-34's dominance. As infantry, we had no armour, no cover, no illusions. When those monsters rolled into our trenches, we let them pass over us, flattened into the mud, trying not to scream. Then we crawled out to face their grenadiers. The only way to kill a T-34 was up close, with a bundle of explosives or a Molotov. You needed nerves of steel and a soul already half dead. The Waffen-SS had no better weapons than the regular army. But we were used like firemen, sent into every blaze, expected to extinguish every crisis. The price was blood. The great divisions of the Waffen-SS would eventually be ground down into nothing. As Heinz Hohner wrote, by mid-war, a third of our divisions already lay buried beneath Russian snow. We were a burnt offering. The winter was finally breaking. The snow remained, but the air lost its deadly edge. At long last, crates of winter gear arrived, thick coats, fur-lined boots, balaclavas hastily knitted by women at home. Too late for most, too late for Robbie. It was the 23rd of February. General Halder's diary that day read, "Especially quiet, but not for us. That day the Red Army came crashing down on our sector. Mortars, machine guns, wave after wave. Robbie had been messenger that morning. When the sergeant beside him was shot clean through the heart, Robbie ran to warn the others. A shell burst just behind him. I ran to his side when I heard him call my name. He was already fading, face pale, eyes unfocused. He smiled faintly. I tried to comfort him, said he'd be going home now. He ignored it. What mattered to him was that I find his parents. "Promise me," he said, teeth clenched against pain. "Tell them I wasn't afraid." I did promise. They laid him on a straw sledge behind a snowbank, waiting for evacuation. I pulled a thick blanket up to his chin. His skin had already turned yellow, but I believed, foolishly, that I'd see him again. It wasn't until later, at a first aid station, that a sergeant said, "We had a boy here with your accent." "Dutch?" My heart leapt. "He's outside now," the man said quietly. "No one could have survived that much shrapnel." I stood at Robbie's grave, a simple birchwood cross at the side of the road in Sosna. Just snow, silence, and the wind. The inscription was as sparse as his life had been brief. SS Schütze Robert Reiling, 1st March 1942. That was all. Months later, I kept my word. On my first leave home, I went straight to Robbie's family, a warm, noble household near Groningen. They welcomed me like a son. I shared every memory I had of him. We wept, we laughed, and in those few days, something unexpected happened. I fell in love with his sister. It was gentle, mutual, and born of grief. We exchanged letters in the months to come. In a war full of ruin, it was the first soft thing I'd felt in years. But grief never travels alone. Less than a year later, Robbie's father, once the General Consul of Liberia and a known NSB man, was gunned down while cycling home, shot in the back, executed in cold blood. Holland had become peaceful in name only. The resistance had become bold, assassinations rose, and with them, reprisals. Even in the Soviet Union, the underground stirred. Thousands of Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, Georgians, and Crimean Tatars joined the Germans as Hiwis, desperate to cast off Stalin's yoke. But the partisans fought back with the same ruthlessness. They wore no uniforms, bore no insignias, followed no codes. The Hague Convention called them illegal combatants, ghosts of the woods and snow, who slit throats in the dark and disappeared by morning. This was the war we knew, not glorious, not noble, just snow, fire, betrayal, and silence. They warned us, but nothing could prepare a man for the horror we would soon face. Those who fell into partisan hands didn't just die, they vanished into a world of torment so savage it felt medieval. We found corpses mutilated beyond recognition, eyes gouged out, tongues and ears severed, their blood soaked into the snow like ink spilled from some ancient curse. These weren't isolated incidents, it was their method. Every village had whispers of it. Torture wasn't a tool for interrogation, it was a ritual. Information was a mere excuse. They wanted to humiliate and destroy, to break German resolve with raw barbarity. We used to think a bullet to the back of the neck was the end. But for many of our captured comrades, that was mercy. That was the best they could hope for. Some men, far from the front, later claimed that had the partisans not resorted to such savagery, the German reprisals wouldn't have been so brutal, perhaps, but no court of history has ever dared weigh both sides equally. In the years after the war, everything became one-sided. They rewrote what happened and judged us in sterile rooms far from the icy woods where we bled and died. They never saw what we saw. They never heard our dead scream. We had rules burned into every soldier's paybook. We were not permitted to harm prisoners, to mistreat the wounded, even if they were partisans or spies. I remember the third pledge clearly. It is a crime to kill surrendered enemies. But what good were pledges when your friend's body was nailed to a barn door, his genitals stuffed in his mouth? In late 1941, we held vast territories. Over 65 million civilians now lived under our control, and among them perhaps 10,000 active partisans, but their numbers exploded. By mid-1942, over 100,000 were striking from the shadows, men, women, even children. Our rear lines were patrolled by older men in ragged security divisions, barely armed and barely trained, trying to contain an insurgency that only grew more vicious. And yet, strangely, many of the most effective fighters weren't even German. Ukrainians, Belarusians, defectors from the Red Army, some fought with us, others against. It was a war within a war. One Soviet source I read later claimed that in those first years, the partisans killed nearly 500,000 Axis soldiers and even dozens of generals. Whether that's true or inflated, I'll never know. But we knew their weapons: knives, pistols, homemade bombs. They didn't fight like men, they fought like ghosts. They'd melt into the woods, disappear into villages, and strike when we were asleep or lighting a cigarette. They used glass bottles packed with petrol and laced with phosphorus or sulfur, hurling them at tanks with suicidal glee. I saw a panther go up in flames once because of one damn vodka bottle. Stalin encouraged all of it. 12 days after the invasion, he issued the order for partisan warfare, and with it came scorched earth. Every road, every grain silo, every bridge, they burned it all. Sometimes it felt like we weren't fighting an army, but the land itself. In the beginning they welcomed us. They offered bread and salt. Girls wore wreaths and waved flags. We weren't conquerors then. We were liberators, but that illusion crumbled fast. The commissars returned. They poisoned the minds of the locals, convinced them we were just another tyrant wearing a different uniform. And in some ways, we were. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS didn't always see eye to eye, especially when it came to occupation policy. We were soldiers, not bureaucrats, yet civilians saw little difference. And when the brutality began, from either side, the bridge we'd built with the people burned to ash. I remember Alfred Frauenfeld, a commissioner in Crimea, a real National Socialist, yes, but a man of reason. He walked freely, unarmed, through miles of hostile territory because he treated the locals with fairness. He knew them. He understood their rhythms. The farms under his jurisdiction flourished. But then there were men like Erich Koch. He governed with a clenched fist, ruled with cruelty, and turned entire districts against us. We had one chance to win the East, and we threw it away. Our warnings to Berlin went unheard. By the time they began changing policies, the Red Army was already approaching Budapest. As for us, winter returned with a vengeance. That winter of 1941 to 42 nearly did to us what it did to Napoleon. The front broke down in places, supplies vanished, frostbite ate through our ranks like fire through tinder. In January, we somehow held off the assault on Moscow. Barely. By March, the snows gave way to mud, and we were buried in filth once again. We weren't the same men anymore. Our faces had aged years in a matter of weeks. Our skin was grey. Some said we looked no different from the Russians, except for the language we spoke and the colour of our rags. Still, we believed in the fight, not against the Russian people, but for them. We believed we were defending Europe, defending civilization. Even Pope Pius spoke of us as defenders of Christian culture. We had come from everywhere: Norway, Belgium, France, Finland, the Netherlands. We weren't in it for glory or riches. We found no laurel wreaths in the East. Only lice, frost, and rot. Some of us travelled in tanks, others in boxcars or sleds pulled by half-dead horses, and we died the same, in pits, in snowbanks, under burning roofs. We crouched in filthy dugouts waiting for orders that never came, slept beside fires that could warm us or give away our position. Sometimes the flames saved us. Sometimes they lured death. In -30-degree weather, you'd hug a burning barrel just to feel alive. At -52, we were no longer men, just bundles of nerves in frozen boots. Napoleon's army had broken at -25. Ours endured worse. We burrowed into earth, clawed through ice, begged for shelter in broken huts. The endless Russian horizon mocked us. It was too big, too vast. You couldn't win against it. You could only survive it. And when we saw the people, those hollow-eyed villagers, we saw no revolution, no triumph of workers, just tired, broken souls. They moved like ghosts. Even their joy was suspicious. One woman with a new scarf. She must be hoarding. A man with clean boots. He must be a spy. The system had bred envy, paranoia, and silence. There was no warmth in their eyes, only fear, only grey. One day, I smashed my shaving mirror. I thought I could find another, but there were none, not in the whole oblast. A lost pocket knife felt like losing a limb. I once entered a state-run shop. It had crates of toothpaste and stacks of powdered makeup, but no toothbrushes. We joked about it, but it wasn't funny. It was a sickness of the soul. We'd walk through markets with shelves groaning under useless goods, Stalin speeches on vinyl, opera arias, face cream by the kilo, but nothing of value. This was Russia, not a country, but a different planet, a land of contradictions, a land asleep under ice and lies. The further we marched, the more it swallowed us, and still we fought, for our comrades, for Europe, for something greater than ourselves. Whether that dream was real or not, I no longer knew.